welcome everybody to our sixth and final Heifer Academy webinar session. Tonight we have Dr. Bethany Dado-Senn, who is a calf and heifer technical specialist with VitaPlus, and she is going to be covering the topic of managing heat-stressed heifers. So, as I said, Bethany is a VitaPlus calf and heifer technical specialist, bringing with her a wealth of experience and expertise in environmental physiology, mammary biology, and calf and heifer management. With a robust background in animal science, Bethany earned her PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she researched the environmental heat stress impacts on the gestating dairy cow and her offspring. Her career has been marked by significant contributions to the dairy industry, including her work as a research scientist and as an active member on the calf and heifer team at VitaPlus. Bethany's role at VitaPlus involves providing technical support and developing innovative nutritional solutions to enhance calf and heifer performance. Her commitment to advancing the field is evident through her extensive research, publications, and ongoing involvement in educational programs for producers and industry professionals. Today, Bethany will be sharing her valuable knowledge on managing and feeding calves during heat stress. We're excited to learn from her insights and experiences, and we encourage you to engage actively with questions and discussions throughout the session. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bethany Dado-Senn. Take it over.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that introduction, Cora, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you all today. As you could probably tell from that introduction, I am very passionate about this topic, and hopefully that there's tangible tips, either if you're an animal scientist or if you're somebody who raises and manages your own heifers. So can you see the
Yes.
slides okay and hear me all right? Okay, we will go ahead and get started. So, like Cora said, we're going to talk about both the feeding and management of heat stress heifers. And heifers is a broad term, right? And I didn't exactly know what Cora wanted me to take with that. So I took the entire life cycle of the heifer, and we're going to talk about each of those. So we're going to start out with some background on heat stress in general and some of my heifer management philosophies, both as a heifer specialist and somebody who raises heifers on her own family farm. And then, like I said, we're going to talk about the life cycle of the heifer and how heat stress impacts her at each of those stages. So starting with prenatal heat stress, some of the consequences of that hyperthermia and management decisions we can make to prevent that. Then we're going to start with a pre-weaned dairy calf, talk about the consequences of that heat stress, as well as management and nutritional interventions for her. Then we're going to wrap up with the post-weaned heifer, all the way up to the pregnant heifer, and same kind of scenario there, consequences management and nutrition. So I like to start with the why. Why does this matter? Why does this happen? So dairy cattle, like any other mammal, any other homeotherm, have a thermoneutral zone. This is the zone in which a core body temperature requires no energy to maintain. It just stays consistent. Now, you can kind of see here that there are lower and upper critical thresholds to that thermoneutral zone. We're not going to dive into the lower today, and instead focus on that upper critical threshold. So this is the threshold in which we begin to see basal metabolic rate inside that animal rise, and that energy is used to try to maintain that body temperature through both behavioral and physiological interventions. And eventually that's not going to be enough, and body temperature is going to rise. So we call kind of that first initial step where basal metabolic rate changes, behavior changes, as thermal discomfort. And then the actual rise in core body temperature is the heat stress. And I'll refer to both of those during this presentation today. Now, you kind of can see here when I look at the upper critical threshold, I have a pretty wide temperature range. We go anywhere from 70 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is a wide one. The reason being that we are talking about heifers at any sort of different age, size, breed, and environmental condition. So the thermal neutral zone is going to be different for a 2-day-old Holstein heifer calf than it is going to be for a 7-month-old Holstein heifer. And differences again with like the Jersey breed one that's being housed down in Florida versus up here in Wisconsin. So that's why we see a pretty wide range. And that's why it's also really important to consider whenever you hear somebody talking about heat stress and intervention plans, or you see it in the literature, that you take into account where the study was taken, and the age of the animal and things like that, because all of that can lead to a lot of variation in animal response. So, when we think about how we manage our animals under normal thermal conditions, we offer the animal her groceries, right? Her nutrients. She consumes them, she metabolizes them into energy, and that energy is then diverted into net energy for maintenance, immune function, and growth is the main one that we really want to focus on. Immune function, too, to an extent, right? For our pre weaned calves, especially. But growth is really where we want to see our energy put to good use. It's kind of the whole basis of feed efficiency. Now, when we think about heat conditions or above that upper critical temperature, we can offer the calf as many nutrients as she wants, as much groceries, but she's only going to eat a certain amount. A hallmark of heat stress is a reduced dry matter intake. So energy generation is going to be less, but energy needs are actually going to raise, right? I kind of mentioned that with the increased need for thermal regulation, there's going to be greater net energy for maintenance, leaving less energy available for that immunity and for growth. So, taking all of this together, when I think about caring for our heifers, I really encourage the folks that I work with, and just as I speak in general, to think about management as a trifecta. Very commonly, we just think about that relationship between us and the animals that we care for, but it really is a triangular relationship between us, the animal, and the environment in which we put her in. So commonly, we offer that nutrition, we provide consistency, but that's not going to be enough unless we think about how our management is impacted by the current weather. On top of that, we're only in front of our animals for a certain amount of time. The rest of the time, they are just exposed to their environment and have to respond to it on their own. So things like bedding and shade and ventilation give that heifer the tools that she needs to respond when we're not there to provide support. All right, so diving in the first category of that life cycle, we're going to talk about prenatal heat stress. And I'll try to be brief here because we're really kind of focused on our postnatal interventions, but I do think this is both really interesting and relevant. So, whenever we talk about that late gestation in utero heat stress, the majority of studies that you will see in this realm have been conducted in a way in which dry cows, so that last 60 days of gestation, are exposed to either a cooling treatment or a heat stress treatment. Now, any of our studies that we conducted in Florida, that cooling consists of fan, shades, and soakers, whereas the heat stress group still has the shade of the barn, but no fans or soakers. Now, we published a number of literature reviews in this area. This one kind of highlights some of the things that we found as to how this late gestation in utero heat stress impacts that gestated calf. So there's alterations in placental function and fetal development during pregnancy, and then after birth, and then all the way up into maturity, we'll see impairments in growth and metabolism, thermoregulation, mammary development and milk production, immune function, and survival and welfare. And I'm going to highlight a few of those here today. So first, looking at growth and development, heifers that are born under in utero heat stress will be smaller from birth to about 8 months of age. And this is smaller in terms of weight, average daily gain, and overall stature. And they're also going to have reduced pre-weaned immune and metabolic organ growth. So heifers that are born under in utero heat stress have a smaller thymus and spleen, so immune-related organs. They're going to have a smaller kidney and actually a smaller liver and a larger kidney and adrenal gland, right? Kind of that continuous response to stress alters adrenal gland morphology. And very interestingly, in my line of work, the mammary gland was also smaller under in utero heat stress. So associated with that smaller mammary gland, we also see some impairments in the overall development of that gland. So there's going to be a smaller proportion of the synthetic tissue called parenchyma. So you can kind of see here at day 63, the in utero cooled calf has parenchyma that's about this side here. That's this pink area compared to the in utero heat stressed heifer. And there's also going to be fewer and less proliferative ductal structures. So within that parenchyma, you can see here the in utero cooled heifer at birth at day 0 has more of these ductal structures, both one that contain a lumen and ones that do not. And then this stain down here, we're looking at any cell that is stained brown. That is a sign of proliferation. So you can see again that this in utero cooled heifer has substantially more brown pigmentation in their ductal structures than do the in utero heat stress heifers. So you might be telling me, okay, that's kind of cool, right? In the first 63 days, there's some differences, but what does that mean long term? Well, this change in mammary gland development at birth is associated with long term consequences. So, daughters that were exposed to heat stress while in utero make less milk across their lifetime. So, we know that anywhere from that first to third lactation, there is going to be a reduction of 5 to 14 pounds per day in heifers that were in utero heat stress before even being born. And then they have a lower survival rate in the herd. They're going to leave the herd just under a year later, 300 days. Now, what's really interesting, and this is pretty late breaking work out of my former lab group, Jimena Laporta, and her grad student Grace, they've looked at the granddaughters of the in utero heat stress, of the dry period heat stress cow. So if I can back up for a second, we think about that dry cow, she's pregnant with her calf. And if it's a heifer, inside that heifer, we already have the pool of eggs that will eventually become that granddaughter. So they are technically exposed to heat stress while they are an oocyte. But how does that impact them? Oh goodness, this would be at least two years later. So there's no impact on that pre-weaned heifer growth for this granddaughter, but incredibly fascinating, there are impairments in that mammary gland development again. So once again, there's going to be a smaller amount of that synthetic tissue, the parenchyma, and they've determined this via ultrasound. So they're looking here at a mammary ultrasound at this darker area. This is the parenchyma. So this cooled group in green is larger than the purple group, which is the granddaughter of the heat stress dam. We also find that there are fewer and less proliferative ductal structures. So again, looking at the total number of ductal structures in the granddaughters of the cool dams, as well as the amount of proliferating cells shown here with the brown staining, more developed in the granddaughters of the cooled dams. So this is a multi-generational impact of in utero heat stress. So again, associated with that early life changes in mammary development, we have also shown that the granddaughters of dry period heat stress dams also make less milk across their lifetime. So anywhere between 3 to 20 pounds per day reduction for heat stressed granddaughters and a numerically low survival rate just due to sample size. We can't prove that statistically, but in my mind, as somebody who practices out in the field, a 450-day earlier departure from the herd is biologically significant. Okay, so hopefully I proved to you that in utero heat stress can be quite detrimental to the lactational and general productive performance of our animals. So what should we do about it? Well, stated blankly, cool your pregnant dry cows and heifers. Now, what this looks like, I think depends a little bit by region. You can kind of see here that I listed shade fans and soakers and put a soakers with an asterisk. Soakers are by far and away necessary down in the southern part of the United States and any sort of region that is some sort of tropical or arid climate. Now up here in the Midwest, we are a continental climate, which means we have more mild summers, but colder winters. And there are not any studies, to my knowledge, that really look at this dry period heat stress to look at the necessity of different cooling strategies. So as somebody who's out in the field consulting with farmers, I often say, like, I don't know if I necessarily need to recommend soakers to you. I would start at least with shade and fans and see what the numbers tell you. But if you want to invest in soakers for your dry cows, by all means, I think it would show some benefit. There's also some recent research out of the University of Florida that looks at the comparison of general soakers versus a smart soaker that is more motion activated. Not surprisingly, they use less water, but are equally as effective in cooling dry cows. So that would be a good strategy to consider. We also have a study out of that group at the University of Florida that looked at cooling dry cows either at the beginning, end, or entirety of the dry period. And the group that was cooled for the entirety of the dry period had the most optimal performance in terms of milk production in the next lactation and also calf size at birth. So I get that question a lot of, like, do I have to do it for the whole dry period? And the answer is yes. The other take home I want you to walk away with is that you cannot rescue these phenotypes by cooling the calf after birth. So if that calf was heat stressed in utero after birth, you can't rescue the growth and immune consequences by cooling that calf afterwards. We have a study that kind of looks at the factorial interaction of those two, and in utero heat stress just sets them back, no matter what we do. Any questions? Okay. Next, we will move on to pre-weaned heat stress. So that pre-weaning period is generally anywhere between that right after birth, so 0 days up to until about 60 to 90 or so days, depending on what your weaning program is like. But in this window of time, under severe heat stress, we see that pre-weaned calves will have reductions in average daily gain, reduced starter and milk intake, and altered feeding behaviors. So in this graphic here on the right, the group that was provided cooling as pre-weaned dairy calves has no reduction in milk replacer intake over any sort of THI, but around a THI of 82, we begin to see a reduction in intakes. And similarly, reductions in weaning weights for a study here by Lopez in Mexico, we see reductions starting at a THI of about 70 to 75. Now, under moderate heat stress, like again, I kind of mentioned up here in a continental climate, there is likely no strong impact of heat stress on these productive parameters. I just don't see that super often with the farms that I work with, where they, report lots of declines in their starter intakes or their milk intakes or their growth throughout the summer months. Again, this is because the main driver of pre-weaning body weight and average daily gain is that prenatal heat stress. But I really do think that heat stress is a comfort and welfare concern, regardless of if we see that productive impact. So anywhere from mild to severe heat stress, we're going to see calves elevate their respiration rates, heart rates, skin temperatures, and rectal temperatures, and change their lying behaviors. So you can see some differences here between heat stress and cooled heifers in terms of thermoregulatory response. And then we conducted a study that was published in 2022 that looked at calf behavioral responses to heat stress. And those that were under continuous heat stress did spend more time lying in this lateral position that you can see here. So they were trying to maximize their surface area and reduce that heat load, versus heifers that were provided cooling spent more time in this position right here. We also know that calf health is going to be impaired under this pre-weaned heat stress. So there's reductions in serum IgG across the first 49 days of life. Again, this cooled group here above the heat stress group in red. There's going to be changes in white blood cell populations. There's a study from out in California that found elevated bovine respiratory disease rates in the summer months for dairy calves. And then we also demonstrated that calves provided cooling had a reduction in total number of treatment events compared to heat stress in the pre-weaning period. Okay, Bethany, that's all well and good. I know things maybe aren't great under heat stress, but how do I know when heat stress is actually happening? Well, the way to do this, and this has been done in the lactating cow model as well, is first we look at what indicators in our animal and the environment are going to be our best way to tell that that calf is heat stressed. So I mentioned some of the ones before, like rectal temperature, skin temperature, respiration rate. Which one of those best tells me that something's going on? And when I measure the environment, what should I use? Should I use temperature? Should I use temperature humidity index? What's going to be my best indicator? And we look at that through things like linear regression models and correlation analyses. And then we also look for benchmarks. And this is done through segmented regression. And that's basically just a fancy word for saying I'm going to plot out all of these indicators and say, like, at each different temperature point, when do I begin to see a change in the slope of the animal response? So like, let's say we stick consistently at a pretty consistent respiration rate up until X temperature, and then all of a sudden there's a drastic incline. That's our benchmark to say something is changing here, and this is when we need to pay attention. So when we've conducted these studies in the past, and there's a group out in Europe who has also done this, we're looking in different climates to see how they might differ in those regions. So in a subtropical climate in the southeast, we have found that a THI between 65 to 69 and a respiration rate around 35 breaths per minute are our key indicators and the benchmarks that are associated with them. Now, in a Midwestern climate here in Wisconsin, we found that an ambient temperature around 70 degrees Fahrenheit and a respiration rate between 40 and 60 breaths per minute are going to be our key indicators and those benchmarks associated with them. So I just want to clarify too, you see two different benchmarks here for respiration rate. This 40 breaths per minute is going to be an early sign of heat stress. So one of those thermal discomfort benchmarks, right? When the animal is beginning to change their response without a rise in core body temperature necessarily. Whereas that 60 breaths per minute is one that's going to be associated with more established heat stress. So whenever I go on farm, the benchmarks that I'm using in practice when I talk about this are 70 degrees Fahrenheit and 60 breaths per minute. We did find that ambient temperature was a better predictor on the environmental side over THI, but if you are somebody who is in a more tropical or subtropical climate, certainly including humidity as a THI benchmark would probably work better for you. Okay, so we've detected that heat stress. Now, how are we going to conquer it? What are we going to provide our animal to get through it? So when we talk about housing strategies, there's a couple of different options. First, we're going to talk about shade. Shade is great because it's simple, it's inexpensive, and it's effective. It's really your first barrier to a heat stress event. Some downsides to shade structures are one, they're kind of cumbersome. They're a little bit difficult to put up. Quite frankly, I don't see a ton of them going up over calf hutches here in the Midwest, partially because they're unstable. All it takes is a big weather event, a lot of rain, a lot of wind, and all of a sudden they go flying. So we have to keep that in mind. Now, if this is something you're considering, you can use different forms of shade, either natural shade through trees or artificial shade from shade cloths. If you are going the cloth route, the recommendation, I believe this is from group Collier paper, if not the Dairyland Initiative. They recommend using 11 to 20 square feet per heifer of 60 to 100% shade block cloth per head. Next option would be maximizing the passive ventilation of your housing structure. So again, a benefit here is that it's going to be inexpensive. It really doesn't take a whole lot of additional resources to modify ventilation. And it has been proven effective in a variety of studies. And I'll get into that in just a second. But the cons being that you do have to kind of monitor things as they go along, right? Like, especially if we're talking about things like curtains, barn curtains have to go up and down depending on the weather and the precipitation. And they also just require modification as we enter into different seasons. So like I said, options would include in a barn setting, pulling curtains up and down, hutch windows, or hutch propping. So the home farm is a hutch system, and modification for us looks like opening side and rear windows whenever we can, but of course under rain events, those have to go shut. Something else that I've seen in practice is more hutch propping, I think, than I was expecting out in the field. But for those that do prop, just make sure that you're using a slender sort of item. I have a customer that used a tire to prop their hutches, and it sounds great in theory, but that tire actually blocked all of the air that they were hoping to move with having it propped, and so it kind of defeated the purpose. And we do know through different studies that also under the system, you're going to achieve air speeds about 1/3 of a mile per hour, which I believe is associated with 0.15 or so meters per second. Okay, now active ventilation. This is some sort of fan structure pushing air through your calf housing. This is going to be greatly effective. We're really going to move a lot of air, which has benefits for that heat abatement and also air quality. On the downside, this does require additional infrastructure. It's a little more intensive, takes a lot more work to set up and take down, and there's costs associated with that. So the options here, if you're in some sort of barn, would be either a barrel fan or positive pressure tubing with variable speeds or summer settings, because unfortunately, a lot of our positive pressure tube systems are simply set more for that air quality and not for moving the enough volume of air for it to actually provide heat abatement. So that's why I say it needs to either have some variable speed or specifically designed for summer situations. And then you can see here, hutch tubing is also something that's currently being explored. Now, this is going to achieve air speeds up to 4.5 miles per hour. So I'm going to play a quick video here. Hopefully you can hear the sound, but I just kind of want to demonstrate what this 4.5 miles per hour sounds like, and then walk through a story of this kind of active versus passive ventilation comparison. Okay, so this is from a study that we published in 2023. We looked at no ventilation versus passive ventilation and this active ventilation setup. And we actually found that there was no distinguishable difference in the performance outcome of heifers exposed to passive ventilation over this active ventilation. And our hypothesis was that heifers actually didn't like all of the noise that was being generated from this active ventilation. We actually demonstrated that they stayed inside their hutch less and thus had less access to the cooling properties of that air movement. So, if active ventilation is something that you're considering, I would strongly recommend that you take noise into account. And sometimes more isn't always better. So, kind of gauge it on your own operation and say, how much air do I actually have to move to see either productive or behavioral responses in my animals? So, all that being said, what am I seeing being used on farm? So, this past summer, we conducted heat stress audits at 14 farms throughout Wisconsin and Minnesota. And we found a couple of different interesting things. One, for animals that were housed indoor, either in a group or individual setting, there was substantial improvements in the environment, both in the airspeed movement as well as the average temperature. So here we're looking at what's the difference between the temperature inside the housing structure versus outside. So the temperature change actually was negative for indoors housed animals. They had a slight reduction inside their housing versus outside, compared to hutches where you see a 2 to 4 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature. But this did not translate into any improvements in calf respiration rates, rectal temperatures, or skin temperatures. Also on this graphic, we can see here that our plastic hutches, shown here in this black or dark blue, they outperformed our poly hutches. So that's the general word we use for the poly hutches. I'm not going to shout out any specific hutch companies because I don't want to throw anybody under the bus. But when we think poly hutches, think of kind of those like circular translucent ones that typically don't have any portholes for ventilation. So these hutches, because they allow more solar radiation in, they're going to be warmer on the average, and maximum temperature is going to be 8 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer inside that hut compared to the outside environment. Now, specifically, when we look at hutch, granted this is a low end, so take that into consideration. But when we provide both shade and ventilation, shown here in blue, we're going to have improvements in the temperature increase inside the hut is going to be reduced compared to those that have ventilation but no shade, or no ventilation and no shade. And they're also going to have improvements in calf outcomes. So respiration rates are going to be lower compared to either ventilation alone or no ventilation and no shade. So this is just on-farm practice, not statistically analyzed, but something that I'm taking to my customers and saying, if you have a hutch situation, what can we do to really try to promote at least ventilation, passive ventilation this is, and shade if it's possible. And then our indoor housing, what can we do to take it to the next level and see an improvement in calf outcomes? So all that being said, if you are someone who resides in a subtropical climate or a climate similar to this, my recommendation to you would be to employ both shade and active ventilation for your pre-weaned dairy calves. And in a continental climate or similar conditions, shade and passive ventilation is likely sufficient. Now, research is continuing to be ongoing in that area. Stay tuned to the Laporta lab. I think they're looking into some of this stuff. But that is my recommendation to you thus far. If you have concerns as to how your calves are currently performing in the summer weather with your current housing setup, conducting a heat stress audit is pretty easy. You can either reach out to me or one of my colleagues. We are based in Wisconsin, but have colleagues over in Michigan and Indiana and that surrounding area. Otherwise, you can do this yourself. It's pretty simple. Like I said, we're looking at the housing internal temperature and air speeds and comparing that to the external temperature. And then also looking at calf responses, so respiration rate, rectal temperatures, and skin temperatures at a time when we're experiencing some sort of heat stress event. Okay, next diving into nutrition strategy. How are we going to feed our pre-weaned calves through a bout of heat stress? Now there's 3 different schools of thought out there. I'm going to share all 3, and then I will share kind of where my head is at with this. First is maintaining your current feeding level. So very typically, this is going to be about 3 to 4 quarts per feeding at 12 to 13.5% solids for 2 to 3 times a day. If you are somebody who elevates your winter plane of nutrition to combat cold stress, you may also considering lessening your feeding levels. So if you're at 4.5 quarts or closer to 14% solids, you can lessen that volume slowly over a period of time or decrease your solids incrementally to allow as much consistency as you can, but get your solids down a little bit. Now, some actual practice research around summer feeding rates. There's one Southeast US study, Oriana Rivas from University of Georgia, that found that 3 to 3.5 quarts of a 12.5% milk replacer sees the maximum benefit. Um, we go much over that, we don't see much growth improvement, and also substantially over that, they saw quite a few bloat problems. So in a subtropical climate, this might be your sweet spot. But then conversely, there is some research to suggest that we actually need to increase our energy density in the summer. This is because our starter intake levels are going to be lower because, again, a hallmark of heat stress is reduced dry matter intake. And so to get the necessary energy into a calf, we need to provide more of that through the milk. But again, more research is needed in my mind. I am pretty hesitant to suggest increasing energy level for pre-weaned dairy calves. I think, especially up here in the Midwest, grain intakes are not that substantially reduced, and quite frankly, are never really that high in a calf that is consuming some of our more advanced or elevated planes of milk nutrition. Where if we were to see a reduction in that grain intake, we are still meeting the needs of that calf through the milk. Of course, be keeping an eye on how that grain intake is going as we get closer and closer to weaning, as that could maybe be a strategy where we need to alter our weaning program or really be promoting starter intakes through different ways. On that note, ways to promote water and starter intake are first on the water side to offer 1 to 2 buckets of lukewarm water after we feed that milk. This is something that we do on the home farm. We try to time it with enough time where that esophageal groove has closed, but close enough after where that animal is still standing and still interested in consuming water. So we all know that water intake encourages that starter intake. It's about a 3-to-1 ratio. So for every 3 pounds of water, we might expect 1 pound of starter intake. And also importantly, in the summer months, because our calves are respiring at a greater rate and sweating, we really need to promote hydration. So the more water we can get into calves, the better, within reason. It's also important to have continuous water access for our pre-weaned dairy calves. We don't have the excuse up here in the Midwest of waters freezing over in the summer months, so that water does need to be available at all times. Now, the water should also be clean and relatively fresh. So we personally dump water every day and replace because milk is going into the same bucket as the water. But if it's more of this kind of permanent situation, as you can see here, we really need to make sure that we're cleaning the waters out at least weekly to prevent the buildup of scum. Another strategy might be considering adding some prophylactic sodium bicarb electrolytes. So this is one of the more weaker of the buffers that's used for electrolytes, and thus it is typically cheaper. So we're able to still promote healthy blood acid balance, encourage water intake by having a little bit of flavor to the water. So this is a great strategy if you know a big heat wave is coming to kind of move calves through the stressful event with a little more ease. And then on the starter side, as typical through the rest of the year, we still want to offer that free choice starter. It is more important in the summer months to monitor daily for that wet or moldy feed. We have more rain events in the winter. And again, because dry matter intake is down, every chance we have to get more starter into calves, the better. Then just as a general recommendation, I suggest replacing that starter once weekly to keep it fresh. Any questions on the pre-weaned calf side? Okay. Finally, moving on into the heifer heat stress category, I like to describe heifers as just this general black box. I'm sure Cora will agree with me as somebody who studied udder edema. This is kind of a forgotten group of animals. And consequently, when we talk about things related to heifers, we're really providing a lot of blanket statements to animals that look very different, right? So like this group here is a group of calves that was, weaned 2-3 weeks ago. So they're three months of age or so. and their nutritional needs and how we manage them through heat stress is going to be way different than how we handle this group of heifers here on the right who are breeding age. So, kind of a black box when we think about how heat stress differs between the two of them and what we can provide to them differently. So, I'm going to be diving a little bit into the unknown here. So, I'm taking a little bit of academic leeway. And if you disagree with me, please let me know. But what we do know on the research side is that under severe heat stress, post weaned heifers, anywhere from 3 months to 24 months of age, are going to have negative reaction on a growth and intake standpoint. So, severe heat stress in that 90 to 100 degree Fahrenheit range is going to lead to reductions in average daily gain, 5 to 25% reduction in dry matter intake, and then thus associated with a reduction in feed efficiency. Also, a pretty interesting study from Japan also found some altered energy storage under heat stress where heifers have higher fat deposition, which is pretty important when we think about heifers tending to get heavier a little bit easier than other life cycles on the farm, and that also impacting mammary development. There's also research to support lower ruminal passage rate under heat stress conditions and alterations to the rumen microbial populations and fermentation process. So heat stress can impair that volatile fatty acid production, which is incredibly important when we think about that early post-weaned heifer that's still working to promote that ruminal development. So, not surprisingly, I think this is an excellent graphic here on the right that kind of shows that while heifers do have altered thermoregulation under heat stress, they don't respond as drastically as our lactating cows because they don't have that metabolic beast that is lactation going on. But still, under heat stress, we are going to see elevations in respiration rate, rectal temperatures, and heart rates with behavioral changes like longer standing times and reduced grazing times. Now, also importantly, there are some changes in health, some impairments in white blood cell proliferation and function. Really importantly, when we think about kind of what kind of animal we're bringing into the lactating string, we do see elevation in heifer subclinical mastitis rates in the summer. They kind of dubbed it summer mastitis in this Fox 2009 paper. And then just generally, when we talk about weather, there's more pathogen exposure. So heifers housed out on pasture, there's going to be greater pathogens, both in terms of bacteria, but also like ticks and mosquitoes. Just more open doors for things to go wrong. Now, basically, any aspect of the heifer reproductive cycle will also be negatively impacted under heat stress. So, when we think about estrus detection, heifers under heat stress are going to have lengthened estrus cycles, decreased estrus duration and intensity. And this is due in part to a depression in the LH surge and decreased estradiol circulation. There's also demonstration of delayed corpus luteum regression and decreased ovulation rate. But if we do by chance happen to detect the estrus of a heat stress heifer and we breed her, there is also going to be impairments in embryonic viability. So that's going to lower the overall fertility of our heifers and their pregnancy rates. Now, let's say we have a heifer that was bred earlier in the spring, but she's going to be exposed to heat stress later on, either mid or late gestation. We did a study, my colleague Bethany Dado-Senn, around 2020, that looked at the very same model of the dry cow late gestation heat stress with this nulliparous heifer who's pregnant for that first time. She's going to be calving. If they are exposed to heat stress during their last trimester of gestation, they're going to have similar outcomes to that of a dry cow. There's elevations in their thermoregulation during their pregnancy, and then reductions in milk yield when they enter the lactating herd. Now, on the calf side, we did find that there were no differences in that birth body weight, but there were reductions in the apparent efficiency of IgG absorption. So that calf is still set off on the wrong foot. And that takes everything for full circle back to that prenatal heat stress, but we won't dive back into that, but just to kind of get you back into that cycle. Okay, so we unfortunately don't have any sort of benchmark or indicator study to look at when heat stress might be occurring in our heifers, but I think it's kind of safe to assume that it's probably somewhere around that same range of like a THI between 68 to 70 or an ambient temperature around 70 degrees Fahrenheit and similar respiration rate outcomes because those are similar in both our calves and our lactating cows. So heifers will probably fall in the middle there too. But let's say we have a hunch that heat stress is going on in our heifer populations. What can we do for them to keep them cool? Now, when we're talking about our post-wean heifers that are not pregnant yet, so anywhere between 3 to upwards of 12, 14 months or so, my recommendations are going to be similar to that of a pre-weaned heifer calf. So offer that shade and some sort of passive or active ventilation, depending on the age and the location in which your heifers are housed. So shade at the bare minimum. Often this will be pasture based. So a tree line, as you can see here, or shade cloth structures that are placed strategically throughout the pasture. So these pictures here are from the University of Florida heifer unit. You can see there's both the tree line, shade structures in the pasture, and then a more galvanized steel situation at the feed bunk. Now, I upped my recommendations here on a per head basis, just because we're dealing with a larger animal that has both more surface area and more heat to dissipate. And then this study by Brown Brandel in 2017 also established like this 12 feet off the ground baseline for our shade structures. They also found that 60% shade cloth with aluminate was as effective as at least an 80% shade block. So aluminate is kind of this like silver material that can be woven into shade cloth that will refract the light. Now, if we're dealing with more of a pregnant heifer situation or around that time where pregnancy can occur, that peripubertal period, um, I'm going to push my recommendations to more of that, what we would be providing a dry cow, at least in the last trimester of a pregnant heifer's lifetime. So if we can't do it the whole time, at least if we can focus on that late gestation period. And that's going to include shade, active ventilation, and soakers. Again, with that asterisk of soakers being like, maybe we need it, maybe we don't, depending on our climate. So there's a couple of studies that show that when we have shade, active ventilation, and soakers, that there's going to be improvements in thermoregulatory responses, growth, and preg rates in more extremely hot climates. So think like Egypt, that sort of area. But another study by Marslack and Embertson in 2009, granted this was in beef heifers, but I think it translates, found that if you're just offering sprinklers, but you don't provide shade, that's not going to be as effective as if you offer shade alone. So not too surprising, right? Shade is going to be our baseline. Active ventilation would be the next on top of that, and soakers would be the third strategy, depending on what your needs are. Now, something that I don't think we really think about enough as an industry yet is the fact that we are shifting so much of our breeding program to include more beef on dairy, which is great. But oftentimes what I see is that farms are prioritizing their sect semen for heifers because they stick better. It makes sense. But what sort of housing are we giving these pregnant heifers? It's not what those lactating cows are getting or those dry cows. Very often it's suboptimal conditions compared to those. So the animal that's continuing the next generation of our herd is exposed to less than ideal conditions compared to her bull carrying counterparts. I think this is something we really need to think about and really be optimizing our pregnant heifer housing. I'm not going to say more so than a dry cow housing because both are welfare concerns, but we need to keep that in mind. All right, when it comes to nutrition strategy, I'm going to be upfront with you and say, even though I work for a nutrition company, this is not my area of expertise, but I did the best that I could. So we, at first, just like any other stage of the life cycle, we need to track intakes and monitor heifer feeding behavior. We're not going to change the total mixed ration, the TMR, until we see drops in intake. Once we see that, we know that there's going to be, again, that increase in the net energy for maintenance requirement by 5 to 10%. And with that dry matter intake, that means that we need more energy density going into the diet. So this can be achieved by slightly reducing that NDF in our TMR. This can be done either by replacing a higher NDF forage with a lower NDF forage, or changing the ration to include a little higher energy feedstuffs like grain, sugars, and fats. So by lowering the NDF, we are going to slightly promote dry matter intake, or by having the higher energy feedstuff, we promote the energy density. Now, if our higher energy is coming from something like a grain or a sugar, we do need to be very careful to monitor for rumen acidosis, and which is why a couple of the papers that I read in this area promoted supplementing a fat source. My colleague Lucas, who does a lot of work in the post-wean heifer space, said that he doesn't see a ton of this change in TMR energy density happening on a lot of farms or farms up here in the Midwest, and I would agree. I don't see a ton of this. If anything, we are seeing adjustments for these latter two bullet points, and that is adjusting our vitamin and trace mineral pack for that reduction of in dry matter intake and the increase in sweating. So we're going to change our sodium, potassium, and magnesium profiles slightly to account for that. And then we want to avoid overheating of our feedstuffs. So our mixed TMR should not be sitting for days on end. It's going to overheat. Animals are not going to eat it. And same goes for forages sitting waiting to be mixed into the ration. And this goes all year round, but especially relevant in the summer months. Our water access needs to be ad libitum and accessible to each animal. So the Dairyland Initiative has some great resources on square footage per animal access at a water bunk. Take those into consideration and make sure they're being cleaned frequently enough to encourage that water intake. Everything we can do there will really make a difference in how our animal handles heat stress in general and also her overall dry matter intake. All right. So, taking all of this together, our summary message for you guys is that regardless of age, heat stress is going to harm heifer growth, health, comfort and welfare, and overall future productivity. Whether that looks like fertility, stability in the herd, or milk production, all of those can be impaired. So, heat abatement strategies, kind of already said this, shade is our bare minimum. Either passive or active ventilation would be the next step for our pre-weaned or post-weaned heifers, and then shade fans and soakers for our pregnant heifers and dry cows. On the nutrition side, we need to monitor intakes, really keep an eye for when that dry matter intake goes down, consider elevating energy densities. In my opinion, more research and practical application is needed here. But if nothing else, offering clean and ad libitum water could potentially solve a lot of problems. With that, I will take any questions. Feel free to follow me on LinkedIn or Instagram. I share a lot of heat stress tips there and also just general calf science and research that I find interesting.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bethany. I am going to monitor if we have any questions come in. Um, yeah, I really appreciate you sharing just the different strategies that you've seen for one, providing shade, and then two, providing ventilation. I feel like that's I I almost want to say a fun challenge of, what can we use that's effective
Mhm.
and that doesn't come with too much of an overhead price where there's a ton of investment and you're like, "Oh my gosh,
Mhm.
it doesn't work." Because I've seen where some folks just do almost permanent installations of shade, and it does a great job. And I'm like, but if there are folks who like to rotate where they have their hutches across the farm or even within a certain area, I'm like, how do you move that? And then you talked about how, one weather event and the very flimsy things knock over. And I'm like, yep, I've had to go run run across a field and pick stuff up before. So yeah,
Yes, my counter argument to that though is down in Florida we had those shade structures and those things survived many a hurricane. So like when I hear people complain like, "Oh, I don't want to do that. It sounds like too much work to blow over." I was like, "They handled it down there. Granted, they
right.
needed it more, but yeah,
That
it's
that could just be some marketing where it's like it can handle a hurricane.
yep. Yeah, I recognize that it's this very delicate balance, like especially because heifers they don't show their cards as easily as a lactating
Yeah.
cow does in terms of performance, negative performance outcomes.
Mhm.
And so that's why I really try to think of like what's what's actually achievable from a cost standpoint, from a time standpoint, because as somebody who does feed calves, like I get it. Like
Yeah.
there's only so many hours in a day, and I don't want to spend it patching up shade cloth and
Yeah.
doing all that stuff. But it is important, it's
Mhm.
and it will only become more so,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, I think an interesting question that I've received, and um this is something I feel with you being both in the climate of Florida and then also up here where somebody asked me the question of, what's the best bedding for a heifer? Not even for a calf in a hutch. They're saying, what can I put on the ground for heifers in a barn? Because it's like straw is too expensive, sawdust too expensive, sand is
Mhm,
too expensive, or just a pain. Like it's either too expensive and or a pain to work with. And he's like, yeah, like I've tried using corn stalks before. And I'm like, corn stalks on cement. Like you're just asking for bumps, bruises, falls, everything else. And
mhm,
he's like, that's
mhm.
what he saw. He's like, but that it's the cheapest thing. And I'm like, but does that also maintain heat like straw would? So I'm wondering if you've seen some other strategies for bedding in both heat and cold.
Yeah, it's like you, saw the slides in the one that I hid to not talk about, which was a bedding slide. Um, there's 2 studies that looked at different bedding sources, Hill in 2011 and Panavivat in 2004. The Panavivat study also it was in Arkansas, I think, so they had, like, some sort of, like, shale bedding or something as an option,
Hmm,
but in both studies, straw was the winner, essentially,
okay.
and I don't actually think either study was in the winter. I think they were
Hmm,
both I know at least the Pawnee Vivat study was, but
okay.
regardless, I actually still do recommend straw bedding, across the different seasons. Obviously, you don't need, like, substantial nesting scores in the summer
Mm,
like you do in
mhm.
the winter, but it's going to be the most optimum in terms of animal comfort, lower dust levels compared to
Yeah.
something like a corn stalk. And the problem I see with sand, and this is what we used at the University of Florida calf unit facility for our pre-weaned calves, is it leads to a lot of oral fixation and ingestion.
Yep.
And then calves get plugged up, and then it's just a whole big thing. So,
Mhm.
actually, the UW herd used it for calves in the summer too. And I don't think there's enough research to support its improvement in thermoregulatory outcomes in the summer. I think it's
Mm,
all kind of anecdotal for me to say, yeah, it's worth doing that over doing straw and not having the stomach issues.
right.
That being said, that didn't really answer your questions in terms of
No.
things other than that. My answer to that would honestly be to do some sort of like we actually do corn stalk beddings too for our post-weaned heifers.
Okay.
But if calf heifer comfort and slipping is a concern, then I would be doing some sort of base
Yep.
of like a barn lime or a sawdust, and
Mhm.
then topping with the corn stalks because then you kind of balance out the whole
Yeah.
cost with, um yeah, and it very much depends on region too, right? Whatever byproduct happens to be in your area is
Yeah.
what we have a turkey plant near us, and so there's
Okay.
farms that use, waste turkey bedding, and,
Hmm.
I would never recommend that in a bajillion years, so don't do that, especially in the summer, but
Yeah. Yeah, I think that would be really interesting to do just a exploratory survey of, hey, what are folks using and what are the options? And then start doing just some comparisons of because you think about oh, the word is escaping me. The word is escaping me. But like canola and those products. I can't think of
Mhm.
the name.
You mean
Uh,
byproduct?
what was that?
You don't mean byproduct, do
Yeah,
you?
yeah,
Okay,
yeah. I was
thanks.
like, is it byproduct? Yeah. So some of those byproducts, um, and seeing of, well, maybe there might be an alternative use for certain byproducts where it's could that potentially be used as a bedding source where it comes out as a dry product
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it wouldn't, harbor too much fluid or too much liquids where then it could just create a bed of
Mhm.
problems.
Yep.
But I think about looking on the sustainability side of things where it's
Yes.
okay, what can we use that may not necessarily be a crop that's grown every year specifically for the bedding purpose,
Mhm,
bedding or
mhm.
feeding
That's a
purpose,
good
but then it's
point.
like, well, if we have this opportunity where this dry product is coming and it's either
Yeah. Mhm.
just going to waste or some alternative use, could we
Yeah,
potentially
yeah,
utilize that? And
yeah.
so,
So in that realm would be, like, things like bean stubble I've seen used,
oh,
like
okay.
soybean stubble.
Hmm.
Um, we've used soy hulls before in our, parlor because we just have a step-up parlor.
Okay.
Um, this is completely anecdotal, but I would certainly use that more on the young stock side than
Mhm.
over on the lactating cow side. We saw an uptick in mastitis and somatic cell counts,
Okay.
by having that in our lactating pen. But those are a couple. Actually, I would recommend for you, Cora, and anybody in the Eastern Midwest region. My colleague Lucas Mitchell, published an article in our Starting Strong that compared all of those bedding types.
Oh, awesome.
Google VitaPlus Starting Strong
Yeah.
bedding, and he kind of does kind of what I just did of like a metric of like, hey, here's my recommendations. Because with things like bean stubble, they sound great in theory, but just the dust generation gets to be such a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like that's just such a big thing, especially if we're in situations where, say, they're in a barn, but
Hmm.
there aren't fans getting
Yep.
used, or
Yep.
even the natural ventilation is
Hmm.
subpar at best, and
Yeah.
you're just praying nothing. If it's not crap weather, you're like, okay, don't get pneumonia, but then okay, you have to
Yeah.
worry about the heat
And
stress and all that.
yeah,
So
more than once that we found that to be kind of the cause of some BRD, bovine
yeah.
respiratory disease issues, is actually it would happen a couple days after a bedding event. It's all
Mm,
that dust
yeah.
generation. So that's
Everyone
why I
starts
talk about that
coughing.
trifecta, right? You know,
Right.
it's not just us providing the bedding to the heifer, it's how she responds to that after we walk away,
Right.
you
Right.
know.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Well, I don't see any other questions coming in, so I am going to share some final wrap-up slides real quick. Do that. All right. Perfect. So, once again, I'd like to thank Dr. Bethany Dado-Senn for joining us this evening and sharing her wealth of knowledge on calf and heifer management. I was really lucky to meet Bethany while we were both serving on the ADSA, American Dairy Science Association Graduate Student Division Board. It's a massive, massive acronym, but it was a great opportunity to work together on that board, and then meet in person once everything was opening back up again. And so it's great that we just maintain the connection and are able to work together and come together on these things, both sharing our passion on heifer management. And so for folks who are attending, if you could please take the post-session survey, that would be wonderful. I am going to plug it into the chat real quick. Um, Perfect. And then, as a reminder, if you would like to access the recording of this, it will be posted on the YouTube playlist. And you should be receiving a follow-up email with all of those links. And once again, with the survey link, if you don't have time to take it right now, you can certainly take it later on. And with this being our final Heifer Academy webinar session, I do want to let you know of other opportunities for heifer education. One of my good friends and acquaintances, Gail Carpenter out of Iowa State University, is actually working with her colleagues over there to put on a heifer management webinar series, just like I did. They are going to be they're taking the approach of almost chronologically going through that heifer's life and talking about how to raise that heifer from almost about breeding, where they're breeding the dam, and how to take care of the dam, just as part of Bethany's work, highlighting a lot of that, and then also on day of birth, of how to take care of that heifer as a newborn and all the way through her lifespan. So um, let me make sure I share that with everybody. If I get lucky to do that, hold on. Maybe, maybe not. Let's see. Well, my slide isn't showing, but that's okay. So, go ahead and look up Iowa State University, Dairy Best Heifer. So you'll be
Mm,
able to look it up through there and or just type in Heifer webinar series Iowa State University and you should be able to find it online. If not, definitely look over our socials. I'm going to be sharing it to help support them and their programming, and also Iowa State Dairy is going to be sharing it as well. So, once again, thank you all so very much for joining us this evening. And if you have any questions, please reach out to us and follow up with any future topic ideas, any suggestions. You can leave all that in the survey as well. So, have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone.